This afternoon, you guys good? This is good to be here. We're excited to have you. Thank you so much for coming out to the American Restoration Tour with Chad Connolly and David Barton. If you know anything about American history, I'm sure you know the name David Barton, and it is an honor to have him with us. We want to just thank you for being here. All of the food that you're eating it's American Restoration. It's Chad Connolly and Faith Wins. They purchased that. That's how much they believe in what they're doing here. So give it up for Faith Wins. You know, at Life Church, we are not afraid to jump into our civic responsibility as the Church of Jesus Christ. And we know that God has called us to do that. We look at our founding, we see that all throughout America's history, that the church was leading the charge for liberty. And we know liberty is not man's idea, it's God's idea. And so that's why we do events like this at Life Church. That's why we partner with Turning Point Faith and Faith Wins and people like David Barton. So that's our heart, is we want to make sure that the church in America is the bulwark, it's the wall that protects against tyranny that wants to totally destroy the liberties and freedoms that God has given us. But one of the ways we do that is we have to get educated, and that's what Faith Wins is all about, and that's what David Barton is all about. So I'm going to invite up to the stage Faith Wins founder, Chad Connolly. Chad's a friend of mine. He was the former Republican chairman of South Carolina, and he is doing amazing things to get the church educated on how to take back our elections. And so would you please give it up as Chad Connolly comes and shares.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks for being here.
Appreciate you, Micah.
Yep.
Y'all give Pastor Micah and Pastor Nathan a hand. I appreciate them. Y'all have awesome pastor leadership. And boy, we're missing that in our nation, aren't we? We really are missing pastoral leadership and truth throughout the country. We're in a battle for truth right now, are we not? And David and I and Cheryl, I know you met her out there. We are just honored to be in Indiana. We were in Wisconsin yesterday, and we leave here today, and we do 3 of these in Michigan tomorrow, and tomorrow night head over to Ohio, do a couple there. I think this is around meeting 100, 102 since February. We'll end up doing around 131 of these in 23 states. I wanted to do 22 and 22, but my word doesn't work out. We're going to do 23 states in 22 because 23 states mattered an awful lot, and we're just honored to be here. We're going to show you a real quick video to kind of tee this up and introduce the concept of what we're trying to accomplish with Faith Wins, but I really do appreciate your pastors, their leadership, and their truth-telling. So David, click that button. Let's show this video.
What would happen if just 4 to 5% of those 30 to 40 million non-voting Christians got off the sidelines, registered to vote, and showed up at the polls? The church will have a voice.
My name is Chad Connolly. When I founded Faith Wins, it was to spread the truth that God's role in America is irreplaceable. Faith wins when people of faith vote their values. Our mission is laser focused on educating, activating, and mobilizing faith leaders, providing them with the tools, the resources, and the messaging to leverage their impact in the political and the governmental arenas. We cultivate, develop relationships with pastors who share the whole counsel of God, who stand for truth. In just a few short years, we've engaged with over 50,000 faith leaders from all 50 states. We've done hundreds of meetings with some of America's leading congressmen, senators, political thought leaders, pastors, and more. And most importantly, we've actually registered over 1 million new evangelical voters during an unprecedented time, an unparalleled success, and all accomplished with just a part-time team. People ask me all the time, what's the secret? It's God's ordained from the pulpit to the pews, committed to faith, family, and freedom. Because with Him, all things are possible.
This is our 1776 moment.
Now more than ever, America's founding principles that were built on biblical values are under attack.
The battle for the soul of our nation has never been greater than it is today.
God has commanded us as His children to be salt and light.
America's great awakenings and revivals have always begun in the local church.
People of faith, Do not underestimate your influence.
You can influence policy decisions and elect public servants with a grounded biblical view who will stand for religious freedom.
Support traditional marriage and the family.
Defend and support Israel.
A voice for the unborn.
People who will defend our democracy and have secure elections.
If believers won't step up to the plate and get involved, who will?
Who will?
Who will?
Who will?
Who will? Who will?
Who will?
You know, it's really not about politics or party or politicians or personality. It's about policies and principles that most closely align with our biblical worldview, from the courthouse to the state house to the White House and beyond. I believe every election matters, but boy, does this one matter more than maybe anyone in our lifetimes. You know, we're going to choose a direction for our nation. Are we going to go to the godless and the heathen and the anything goes, no boundaries? Or are we going to restore us a republic, as the pastor buddies said on the video? And I'll give you a little bit of background on me and why somebody from South Carolina standing in Indiana. I grew up in a little town called Prosperity, South Carolina. It's a big place, home of 400 or 500 or 600 now. We actually did the tally the other day because my wife kept saying, it's bigger than that. So there's like 1,100 voters in my town, but I tell them that's just counting the dogs and the cats. But we have a traffic light now. Sometimes there's cars there. And I grew up, had a drug problem growing up. My daddy drugged me to church and drugged me to youth group, and it wasn't my idea. My dad did not have time out. He had wear out. It was belt clear and loop time. Here comes Bruce. And you were terrified, right? And after a while, your brain and your behind have a serious conversation. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And so my dad's still my hero. He's 83. He's a great curmudgeon. He's a great old guy, man. He'll tell you about life. But if I can be 1/10 of the man my dad's been, I'll have lived a pretty good life. And he taught me how to follow the Lord and how to be a leader and how to be a godly husband. And that's what I've tried to do my entire life. But went to Clemson, got my degree in engineering. After that, I met my college sweetheart. We got married, Michelle and I did, and we got in the Army. I was in the Army. I was a tanker in the Army. Any veterans out there, thank you, Deep Val, for your service. I very much appreciate you. I didn't have to get fired at. I didn't know it never had to be in combat, thank the Lord. But I tell you, I never climbed in my M1A1 tank that I wasn't thinking that there's a sacrifice attached to this. And I started thinking about the men and women who did die for our freedom. And as a Christian first, I recognized we can't do what Jesus did, right? Jesus saved us from eternal damnation, from hell, from eternal consequences. But those men and women who died for our freedoms gave us this freedom on earth. And it's maybe that little bit of a picture of what Christ did for us in a bigger way. And so I started thinking through life. I never had confronted my patriotism. I had never confronted my love for the Lord. I never really thought about it. But I came face to face with, do you really believe what you really believe? And it was the Army. Bless you. I had to think through this. Do I really believe in this? And so I started reading biblical worldview books. The idea that my God's big enough to be everywhere, all the time, and everything. Let's face it, the godless have tried to tell the godly how to live. They've tried to say, ooh, you Christians, you shouldn't be involved in politics. That's going to offend somebody. And we're the very ones who don't want to offend. We want to reach people. But we've put on our turn the other cheek Jesus, and we back away. And I think times dictate we better find our turn the tables over Jesus and find some righteous indignation. Amen. And so this has been a 30-year quest of mine, my entire adult life, trying to figure this out. And that's how I found David Barton's stuff. Started reading it, started coming into contact with real truth, and you recognize we're in a battle for truth. It's a spiritual battle. I can walk in here and I can say the room's 400 feet wide, and Pastor Nathan can say, no, it's 360 feet wide. And it is only opinion until we have a measurement by which to measure it. And then we put that tape measure out, we have a measurement of truth. If Pastor Micah goes down to the community college, they want him to pray, and they say, what are you going to pray in? He can say anything. Anything. He can say, I'm going to pray in goat's breath or the wind or eagle's feathers. Ooh. That's wonderful. But if he says, I'm going to pray in the name of Jesus, all hell will break loose. Because truth exposes error. And the only way error wins is to hide and lie about truth. That's what's happened in our history in America. They've lied about it, they've covered it up, they've glossed it over, they've called you bad names for believing in truth, for goodness sakes. That is where we are. So here I was, I'm learning all this stuff. I'm a young man, Michelle and I are living our lives. We feel led to get involved in politics, not official, but we knocked doors, we made phone calls, we waved signs. My boys were born, CJ in 1997, Bennett in 2000, sippy cup in the mouth, a sippy cup in the hand, a pacifier in the mouth, and a vote for somebody sign. We were engaged, trying to find Christians to run, knowing that Jesus ain't running, right? Jesus isn't running. He's not running for school board. He's not running for president. Therefore, you're always voting for the lesser of two evils because they're human beings. They're normal people. They're fallible. They're not perfect. So you learn what I said on the video. We don't vote for politicians or parties, but we do vote for principles and policies that align with our biblical worldview. And you know, I don't believe life is a political issue. It's a spiritual one. Traditional marriage is not a political issue. It's a spiritual issue. The defense of Israel or religious liberty, you can go right down the line. Yes, they've been politicized, but that doesn't remove my responsibility as a dad, a husband, a Sunday school teacher, and a deacon in my little Baptist church from telling the truth. Even if truth tries to be pushed aside and lied about, we're to tell the truth and stand for truth. And so here I was, we're getting involved, CJ and Bennett, Michelle and I, we're doing our thing because we're going to do our best to elect good people. In 2005, Michelle's mom died. In 2006, long story made short, my wife, 18 and a half years, committed suicide, took her own life, left me a single dad with 2 little boys. The important part of the story is this. I had spoken at Chick-fil-A. One reason we serve Chick-fil-A all over the country is they're a company worth edifying. And they've been so good to me and my family. They have a Monday morning devotional. In 2006, I was invited in to speak on marriage and family. It was very humbling. Nobody knew my wife's home with deep depression. Now, I never saw suicide coming. But I said something I'd never said, and y'all know the best stuff comes from the Holy Spirit, not from you. And my boys were sitting over here in the corner, so the entire corporate office of Chick-fil-A is out there. And I looked at the boys and I said something, as many times I've spoken. I said, you know, I've messed up, I've made mistakes, I've even had business failures. I'm not going to be a failure before God and man with my wife and my boys. I remember looking at the boys, and they love Chick-fil-A headquarters. You can eat all the Chick-fil-A you want to eat. The original Batmobile was in the lobby. Boys love that. And those of y'all who've raised boys know they can eat some groceries, right? Where'd you put that third sandwich, man, in your pants leg? So we're loving this. I look at them, and I remember thinking, hey, Lord, that was good. I'm gonna use that line again. I'm not going to be a failure before you and man with my wife and my boys. That was Monday. The following Sunday, I taught my Sunday school class, like always. And I came home. The boys were on my heels. We had literally prayed for her deliverance that morning. I prayed, Lord, please deliver her from this depression. She just spun out when her mom died. It was weird, fluky thing. And I knew she was bad, but you don't ever think somebody's going to put a gun in their mouth, right? That's not logical. So we walk in through the laundry room into the kitchen, and in my office, I see what I think was a stuffed animal, and it was her blonde hair right there at the door, and she was gone. So the boys were on my heels. I pushed them away, go to your room, and I pulled Michelle to me, which probably wasn't the best idea long term, but I pulled her to me, and the devil said, ha ha, you failed. And you failed. After my quote from the last week, I'm not going to be a failure. Ha ha, you failed. I lay her back down. The boys are gone. I'm calling 911. I'm calling her dad. I'm calling my mom and dad. Please come get the boys. I feel the Lord tell me this was not my plan, but I have a plan for Satan's disruption. Just like that. I lay Michelle back down, and Romans 8:28 leaps up and punched me in the face. Now, I wasn't reading it and I wasn't studying it, but Scripture says we're to hide Scripture in our hearts, and it comes back out, right? And so, y'all know what Romans 8:28 says, and we know all things work together for good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Here's what I told the Lord, and I'm not proud, I challenged him. I lay her back down, I pushed go to your room, go to your room. They're 5 and 9. They've seen something, nobody ought to see that, right? Nobody ever ought to see that. Romans 8:28 punches me. Now, I have read Scripture before when I had to go back and read it again, so I wasn't sure what I read. Anybody else admit to that? Other times it reaches up and grabs you and pulls you down, and that's what Romans 8:28 did. And here's what I told the Lord. All things? Really? Really, all things? And he asked me if I believed it the day before, and I said, yes, Lord. He said, I need you to believe it today. And I told him I would. He said, trust me. I told him I would. Now, I had a hard time I fainted in the casket room because my little boy Bennett, who was 5, said, Mommy would like this one. It had angels on it. And a pastor buddy of mine from Frisco, Texas, caught me before. There's a casket room you go and pick out. It's awful. I guess that's what they got to do. I had never even processed the idea of looking for a tombstone. That was never on my shopping list. Ooh, let's go tombstone looking. You don't do that. I had 3 or 4 months I just couldn't get off the mat. And my mom and dad were phenomenal. My church, Pastor Nathan, what do people do without a home church? When they go through stuff, what do they do without a home church? My church was phenomenal. The Casserole Brigade, man, we call that our church. They were awesome. I needed that. But at the end of the day, I got 2 little boys who were asking me hard questions, sitting on the bed crying every night because Mommy's not there. 3 or 4 months later, the first thing I went to, 5 months later, was I'm on a pro-family board in South Carolina, and one of my buddies was just consistent. The first time in November he sees me, he makes a beeline. Hey, Bo, I know you're not ready. When you are, I got a girl you need to meet. I'm like, JD, get out of my face. I love you, man, but leave me alone. I'm having a hard time. He left me alone. We go back to the meeting for December to approve the budget for the next year. I walk in the door. He makes a beeline. Here he is. Hey, Bo, you got to meet this girl. JD, what are you doing, man? I don't have time. I'm having a hard time, buddy. And JD did what a good Christian brother would do, and he got in my grill. He said, Chad, I've been watching you speak for years. You're Mr. Positive. This ain't going to beat you. He said, you know that talk you do about counting your blessings? Do y'all hate it when people use your words against you? I really hate that. He said, read your notes. And I went home, and the boys and I put all her rings and stuff in a little safe, and we prayed over that, and the Lord gave me 3 very specific prayers, and I wrote down 103 blessings because I'd written the notes on that talk. JD knew it. The next month I go back, I'm reading those prayers, I'm believing God's got a plan. I tell the boys we're going to move on. I'm holding on to Romans 8:28. I go to the meeting, here comes JD. You got to meet this girl. Man, go give it a rest. I said, okay, what's her name? He said, Dana. I said, big question, because I had prayed specifically not to have a guy in the picture. That was my prayer. I never prayed for a widow, but I just knew I didn't want to trade kids on the weekends. I was praying for a widow, right? Okay, how'd she get single? He said, same way you did. Turns out her husband took his own life 2 years, almost to the day before my wife. That's 15 years ago. Dana and I have been married 15 years. She had 2 little girls. I had 2 little boys, and here's why I told that whole story. I learned God wasn't done with me yet. I wouldn't have given you a plug nickel, which is worth nothing, for me standing here or anywhere else trying to encourage you or anybody else. And yet God restores. He's the repairer of the breach, right? And he showed me he wasn't done with me. And here's my message. If he's not done with me, he's not done with you. He's not done with your church, and he's not done with America. Amen. This is our time to reemerge. So I get back involved in politics. Dana's there. We got 4 little kids. We have a honeymoon. We come home to 4 children between 10 and 5. We're putting together a new family. At the same time, I run for state party chairman a couple of years later. I get elected. Y'all probably know South Carolina's a big deal in the presidential preference politics. It goes Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. I literally did every political show on television. You can go back and do the Googling. You can watch them, have some good entertainment. I was on MSNBC on Reverend Al Sharpton's show, who kept whispering in my ear, call me Reverend Al. I'm like, I ain't calling you Reverend nothing. I got far too much respect for reverends to put you in that category. And so I'm doing this show, and I'm on my theme about promoting my state, but I'm beating up the party for ignoring and taking for granted the faith vote. That's been my common theme for now 30 years of my life. And I said over and over and over, those shows and others, it's not that people in the church want to be R's or D's, but they do want to vote biblical values. And they do know that there are some parties who've given this up completely. You're not even talking to them. You know, the experts, you shouldn't mention their name, but experts with initials like Karl Rove, they just take for granted, you know, the Christian vote's going to show up. And the truth is they don't. They want to know where you stand on the issues. Well, a guy named Reince Priebus saw me on the TV show, and he texted me. He said, hey, great job defending your faith in a hostile environment. I'd like to get to know you, and I'm a believer too. It was just like that. And I knew him. I'm one of his 50 chairmen, but I didn't know the guy. So we meet after the election. I'd said on CNN, I thought that Obama's Department of Justice was going to be the worst train wreck of a disaster for Christians and religious liberty. I'm not a prophet by any means, but I was right. For the first time in American history, your tax dollars were used to sue Christians for living their lives, for being florists or wedding planners, photographers or whatever. And if we are so naive to think that doesn't come from the church and the Christian school, we're crazy. We are missing out on this. And so I go see Priebus. We form a thing called GOP Faith. I got to be the first ever national director of faith engagement for the party. From 13 to 17, I went to 43 states, spoke to about 80,000 people, pastors, mostly in meetings like this. Message pretty simple. We don't need you to charge the beach at D-Day. Can you register everybody to vote in your church? Can you make sure they vote biblical values? That's it. That's it. Can you register everybody? And as soon as some pastor says, and they're hiding behind the pulpit saying, ooh, we don't do politics, ask them, do y'all do Bible? Can you tell me where politics begins in your Bible and spiritual life stops? Because I don't think it's any different. I think we're supposed to be engaged. We're supposed to be involved. And Matthew 5 salt and light verses are pretty clear. If you're not, Scripture says you're good for nothing, to be thrown in the street and trodden under the feet of men. I do not want to be called good for nothing by the Father. So we flipped 9 Senate seats in 2014. 2016, a guy who, evangelicals probably wouldn't have helped, got 81% of the evangelical vote. We never told him who to vote for, but we told him to vote biblical values, and it was a modern day record of 81%. I left the RNC in 2017. I started Faith Wins then. It was just a God thing. I had a mentor who said, go do it on your own. For the last 5 years, I've been traveling the country. For the last 2 with this couple that are awesome, unbelievable people, David and Cheryl Barton. Well, we got involved in a little state called Virginia. Virginia had a problem in 2021. The legislature had to solve a problem. You know how politicians are. We're going to fix this for you. Their problem was not roads and bridges and potholes and taxes. No. They had babies surviving abortions. They didn't know what to do with them. So get this. They already tried to abort them. They live. What are we going to do with these babies? The Virginia legislature passed a new law that said they're going to let those babies, quote unquote, die comfortably. The then governor was in the chambers and got up and stood and clapped. That's evil, wicked, y'all. That's awful. Me and you would have got them a blanket. We'd have saved their lives. We'd have taken, no, they die comfortably. We didn't tell people to vote for, but we found 312 churches to do voter registration. 77,000 new people sitting in churches that had never voted before voted, and a guy named Glenn Youngkin won by 65,000 votes. Now, I don't know if we helped or not, but we found 77,000 Christians who never voted before, and the guy won by 0.6%. One of my pastors who got really close to Governor Youngkin was a little upset at the inauguration. He didn't hire a pastor. He didn't have a pastor there to say the prayer at the end. You know why? Because at the end, Governor Youngkin prayed in Jesus' name in his own inauguration. That's the difference. The state of Virginia goes from having a governor who applauds killing babies who survived abortions and let them die comfortably to a governor who prays in Jesus' name. That's Christians making a difference. I don't care what you say. The other thing that came out of that, and I'm going to talk about this with that QR code at the end. 1,343 people in those churches stood up and said, I want to be a poll watcher. I want to be a sworn election officer. We believe it ought to be Christian eyeballs on the process. It should be easy to vote and hard to cheat. I'm not saying anybody's cheating. I just want to make sure it's easy to vote and hard to cheat. I just think it looks odd when we find out things like one person registered 27 times. We didn't think that was right. One place registered 17 people out of the same address. They called me and said, what do you think, Chad? I said, it's a big house. We sent Sunday school teachers and Sunday school classes to check it out. It was a field that had registered 17 people. And we started turning that stuff in. Y'all, now's the time for the church to engage this deal. We believe we're getting to see a front row seat of the awakening of America. People saying, I've had it. Let's put biblical people in office. Jesus is not running. There's no perfect. Let's go find the best ones that most closely align with a biblical worldview. And the best person in America to teach them the background of that, to show the proof, the truth about America's role, God's role in America to make this the most free place in the world. This is such an awesome country that people who hate it won't even leave. I think that's awesome. We got more whining going on about how bad America is, and I have been places I have disliked. And you know what I did? I got out of there. Yep. If you go somewhere you don't enjoy, just leave. No. We'd rather whine and complain and fuss and moan about it instead of leaving. And all I notice is there's a long line of people waiting to get in this place called America. And if you find somebody that knows more about American truth and history than David Barton, you need to introduce them to me. He and his family own 160,000 pieces of original American documentation, 120,000 before 1812. So if you find some pointy-headed nerd university professor saying, I think the founders meant, no. David and Cheryl and Wall Builders own it. It's factual. Micah's put his hands on it. We've seen Bibles owned by the founders. After this, you're going to want to beat feet, get that Founders Bible. It connects the truth about America's history, how they founded it, how they created the principles, the American story, telling the stories about America, about God's role in our nation. And this guy is unbelievable. I have drugged them around America. We've been all over the place. We've been just about in every state you can name. We got about 30 more of these meetings, and I think 11 more states between now and Election Day, because we are determined to make an impact for God in our nation. We're committed to doing this, and we appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate your pastor leadership. And y'all need to buckle on tight. You're going to think two things. You're going to be nudging people, I wish so-and-so had been here. And the second thing, you'll want to leave here and find your history teacher and say, you ripped me off. Why didn't you teach me this? Because I should have known this. Y'all help welcome up America's greatest living Christian historian, my buddy David Barton.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks, guys. Thank y'all for being here. I want to start this morning with American Bible Society. They come out every year with the State of the Bible Report 2022. American Bible Society was started in 1816 by founding fathers. It's the oldest Bible society in the world. It's the largest Bible society in the world. They give out 200 million Bibles a year. And in their 2022 report, and they do this every year, what you find is if you look at the chart here, there's a drop over here on the right. What they documented was last year, we lost another 26 million Americans who no longer read the Bible at all. I mean, it's on the way down. Bible reading's going out. This is the lowest it's ever been in America's recorded history. We've never had this kind of biblical literacy. Now, from a spiritual standpoint, we know Jesus tells us in Matthew 4 that man doesn't live by bread alone. He lives by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. So we know that just like we have to feed the body as we're doing right now, we also have to feed the spirit as well. Spiritual man needs food. And we're not doing a real good job with that now. As Americans, we do a great job of feeding the body. I mean, we'll get our 3 a day. There's no question. We won't miss that, but we don't do the same spiritually necessarily. So I'm going to encourage you, maybe you already do it, I'm going to encourage you to do more of it. You need to find a way to read the Bible every day. Remember, Jesus in the Lord's Prayer said, give us this day our daily bread. You need at least 1 spiritual meal a day. I mean, we get 3 physical meals a day. Get 1 spiritual meal a day. And also go a step further and get a little more serious, and that's by memorizing Scripture. It's more work. It takes more effort to do that, but it's significant. Let me show you why both of these are really important from an American history standpoint. If I take you back to 1787, we have 55 founding fathers writing the Constitution. Of the 55 founding fathers, nobody was happier about what was going on than Ben Franklin. He's the first guy in our history to call for the United States of America. He did it in 1754, 33 years before the Constitutional Convention. And at that point in time, it didn't happen. It wasn't going to happen because we had 13 nations back then. We don't have colonies. We had nations. They didn't even really like each other. It's a lot like Europe is. Europe's been trying for years to get a European constitution, and they can't get together on it because Poland says, man, we'd love to have a constitution. We're going to put God right up top in the Constitution. France says, if you have the word God anywhere in that Constitution, we're not going to be part of it. And so this is the kind of conflict that's gone between all those nations. So they don't have a European Constitution. It was not that different in the American colonies. You had North and South Carolina. They didn't even like each other. They had border wars back and forth. They each had different currency. You had to change your currency to go from North Carolina to South Carolina. Maryland and Virginia had border wars. So we were 13 nations back then. He's calling for us to be one nation, set aside that stuff, and they just weren't ready to do it. By the time you get to 1787, they're thinking about it now. They've come a long way. And so Franklin's there at the Constitutional Convention, and this is Franklin right here. And at this point in his life, he's 81 years old. And that's not particularly impressive to us because today in America, the average lifespan is 80 years old. He's 81 at that point, and the average lifespan back in 1787 was 33 years old. So consider how old he is compared to the rest of them. Pretty impressive. And he's really happy this is going on, but as the days go on, he gets less happy about what's going on. And about 5 weeks into it, he really is discouraged. because what's happened is all the 13 have come with their own agendas. You had the Virginia plan for the Constitution, the Connecticut plan for the Constitution, New Jersey plan for the Constitution, New York plan for the Constitution. Of course, New York didn't want Virginia's, Virginia didn't want Connecticut's, Connecticut didn't want Jersey's. And so 5 weeks in, this thing literally is falling apart. Alexander Hamilton has left. He's going back to New York. He said, I got better things to do than fight with the rest of you here. I'm out. You had George Mason, same thing. He says, I'm tired of bickering with everybody. I'm going back to Virginia. The thing literally is falling apart. At that point, Franklin sees the dream of his life going out the door. And at that point, he delivers a very passionate speech to the delegates. It was Thursday, June 28, 1787, and he delivered a lot of speeches before this. But every speech he delivered before this, he went home that night at the end of the convention, thought about it, he wrote out his speech, and then had someone read the speech the next day. So he didn't deliver any of his own speeches. He had a lot of speeches, but he wrote them all out. Somebody else delivered them. This is the only speech he gave himself. He gave it without writing it out. We know what he said because James Madison took notes at the convention, so we know what Franklin said. And so this speech is just out of the heart. It's off the cuff. It's just the passion of his frustration. And this is what he tells them. He said, gentlemen, he said, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we've not once hitherto thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? He said, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. Now, this is the room in which 11 years earlier they signed the Declaration of Independence. Back then, we did not have a bicameral system. We didn't have a House and a Senate. We had one body. It was unicameral, but it had 3 chaplains, and they prayed a whole lot. Matter of fact, by the time you get to 1815, there had been 1,400 government-issued calls to prayer in America. And as he said, our prayers were heard and graciously answered. Just check the writings of George Washington. He has 250 acknowledgments of God's direct intervention in what went on. He saw God's miracles time after time, whether it was the Battle of Brooklyn Heights or the Battle of Trenton, or whether it's the Battle of Brandywine or the Battle of Yorktown. 250 occasions he talks about how God intervened. And so that's what Franklin's saying. Guys, we've seen God all these last years intervene. He said all of us engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? He said, I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of man. He said, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We've been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. He said, I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we should succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel, and we should become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. He said, I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Now, I think we can agree that that has a spiritual tone to the speech. That's got a spiritual element to it. And I think we can also agree that Franklin is the least religious of the Founding Fathers. Of the 250 folks we call Founding Fathers, he, hands down, least religious, not disputed. That's not bad for your least religious Founding Father. See, what happens is professors, they say, oh, the Founding Fathers, atheists, agnostic, deists, look at Franklin. Franklin may be the least religious, but that's a comparative term. You see, somebody in this room right now is the least religious person here. Doesn't mean you're religious hostile or anti-God or anti-Jesus. Maybe it means you're 99.6% when everybody else is 99.7%. It's a comparative term. It's not a term of hostility. And we've made it into a term of hostility and made him representative of how none of the Founding Fathers are Christians. That speech that Franklin just gave, you've read it. It's 14 sentences long. Here's the question I got for you. How many Bible verses did Franklin quote in that speech? You saw a religious tone. How many Bible verses did you recognize? You should have recognized 14 Bible verses because these are the Bible verses he quoted in that speech. Now, this is your least religious Founding Father. He's doing this without notes. He's just doing it out of his heart. How in the world does Franklin know that much Bible? Jesus tells us. In Matthew 12:34, Jesus says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So what's on the inside is going to come out the mouth. And that's hate, same thing, anger, rage, whatever it is, or if it's God's word on the inside, it's going to come out. This tells you how much Franklin had memorized in the way of Bible verses. That just when the emotions got going, what came out when he started talking? Bible verses. See, this was common for back in the day. And I'm going to show you what it was in schools and other founding fathers as well. And Franklin's got a real interesting exchange that he had with a minister. Minister Samuel Cooper. He's one of the famous ministers up in the Boston area. He was the pastor of John Adams and John Hancock and Sam Adams and all those guys. And Franklin's really close to so many ministers and writes back and forth with a lot of them, with Ezra Stiles and George Whitfield and all these others. And he was talking, as these guys wrote back and forth, he told Dr. Cooper, he said, he said, there's a real difference between crowds in America and crowds in England. He said, when I speak in America, like if I'm up in New England and speaking to a crowd up there, he said, I never have to tell people when I'm quoting the Bible, because we've all studied the Bible, we all know it, we all recognize the Bible. He said, but when I go to Europe, and he was ambassador to France, America sent us ambassador to France, ambassador to England. He said, whenever I'm in Europe and I give speeches over there, he says, I have to tell them when I'm quoting the Bible, because they don't know the Bible over there. They're so secular, they don't know the Bible. This is what he explained. He says, it's not necessary in New England, where everybody reads the Bible and is acquainted with scripture phrases, that I should note the Bible references from which I take them. I don't ever have to tell. Did you see him quote any Bible verses out loud at the convention? He didn't say the scripture says. He didn't say, here's a verse from Deuteronomy. He didn't say that because everybody recognized it. This is what we did in America. He says, but I've observed that in England as well as in France, that verses and expressions taken from the sacred writings and not known to be such appear very strange and awkward to readers. I have to tell them when I quote the Bible there because they don't recognize it. America today has become what Europe was 200 years ago. We don't recognize Bible verses when they're spoken because we're just kind of unfamiliar with them. Another example of this, if I take you to Patrick Henry, the one speech that is covered in some places, we don't even cover this well anymore. We have a network of legislators called Wall Builders Pro-Family Legislative Network. We got about 1,000 legislators in the network. We work with them throughout all 50 states. Last year we monitored 159,000 pieces of legislation. We know the issues that are going on and what's happening with them. And with all these legislators that we have, significantly, you see these legislators and what happens. Well, Patrick Henry is in the legislature and he's there. And as a legislator, he's really kind of ticked off over an issue that's going at that time. Because he's a young legislator, he's in the Virginia legislature, and in the history books, or at least in some of the history books, you'll find this Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death speech that he gave. Now, the reason I talk about Wall Builders Pro-Family Legislative Network is because all the states have different cycles for approving history standards or health standards or English standards or math standards. In Texas, every 12 years, we approve the new standards for the next 12 years. Some states it's 10 years, some states it's less, some states it's more. But we were contacted this year by states such as Minnesota. Minnesota said, we just passed our standards for the next 10 years, and for the next 10 years, we will not teach the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, World War I, or the Holocaust. They're all out. We're going to teach 1619 and CRT. Now, he was distressed about it, but that's what Minnesota voted to do. Even down in a state like Louisiana, you consider conservative, red state. We testified at the legislature down there. Even in Louisiana, they said, no, we're not going to teach World War II anymore. We're not going to teach the Holocaust. I mean, this is going across the nation now. And so we're becoming more and more historically illiterate. So if we see this speech in a history book, this Patrick Henry speech, what happened was, at this point in time, America, we've had stuff going up in New England, Lexington, Concord. We've had stuff going in Williamsburg, Virginia. We've got all this stuff going on, and all these senior legislators saying this is really bad, but there's nothing we can do about it. Great Britain's the greatest military in the world. We don't have an army. We don't have a navy. We can't do anything. We're just going to have to do what they say and just put up with it. As much as we just like it, that's the only option we got. And Patrick Henry, who's a young legislator, has just had it up to here with the cowardice. And his speech is essentially, get a backbone, guys. Stand up. Stand for what's right. If you do, God will help you. And so he gives that speech, and you can look it up online and see it. And what you'll find is in 14 sentences in that speech, he actually quotes 11 Bible verses. These are the verses he quoted. And it's the same kind of passionate speech, not with notes. He just gives us off the cuff, if you will. And I'm going to suggest to you that the kind of verses they memorized back then aren't what we do now. We might know John 3:16, But the chances that we know 2 Chronicles 32:8 or Deuteronomy 32:4 or Psalm 75:7, those aren't the verses we memorize. This is what came out of them when they started speaking. One more example, George Washington, the only president we've ever had to be elected unanimously. In 1790, he says, you know, America is not used to really being a nation yet. We're still the 13 colonies, 13 separate things. He said, I think it'd be really good if I were to go visit individually every single state, let them see the President of the United States, let them know that we're part of a nation. So he lays out a 2-year plan by which he goes to all 13 states. And think about, at that time, the national capital's in New York City. So he's going to get on a horse or in a carriage, and he's going to go all the way to Georgia and all the way to Carolinas, which is what he did. So every state he visited in that 2-year plan. And in 1790, one of the states he was going into was Rhode Island. And when word got out that President Washington's coming to Rhode Island, he got a letter from the Hebrew congregation in Newport, a Jewish congregation, and the letter was effusive. They said, we so thank God for you. He raised you up for this time. You protected our religious liberties. You defended our freedoms. And it's just a real effusive letter, you know, just you're great. And Washington gets that, and he writes back, and his letter is much more presidential in reply. He's a little more modulated. He said, well, you know, thank you guys. That's a really nice letter you sent, and I'm looking forward to seeing you when I get there. And so his letter back to the Hebrew congregation is only 2 sentences. It's interesting that in 2 sentences, he quoted 10 Bible verses in those sentences. These are the Bible verses he quoted in those 2 sentences. Now, one of the things we do at Wall Builders in the summer, we do a lot of training for teachers, and do a lot of training for legislators, et cetera. But we do a lot of training for 18 to 25-year-olds who are going into college or who are in their master's program or a doctoral program. We know what they get taught at college, and we know what they haven't seen. And as Chad pointed out, we have those 160,000 original documents. We got everything from Columbus all the way. We've got the Bible that landed on the moon with Apollo 14. So we got all this stuff and tens of thousands of original documents. And one of the mornings as we're with the young people, we will lay out tables with just founding father letters on them. Here's Abigail Adams, and here's John Langdon, and here's John Witherspoon, all these letters. We'll put out these letters, the original letters, and we'll put out a bunch of concordances. They go, okay, take the Bible concordance, take a letter, and find out how many Bible verses they quote. Because all the letters are like, I don't know that anybody quotes more Bible verses than Abigail Adams does. I mean, her letter is just almost like reading the Pauline epistles in some way. She takes verse after verse after verse and arranges them to say what she wants to say. And so this is the way it had been. And so what you find back then is that all these guys had hidden God's word in their heart. Psalms 119 says, hide God's word in your heart. They did that. Bible memorization was a big part of it. We just don't recognize it today because we don't know the Bible the way they used to. Now, significantly, as you look at what we have today in the nation, we've been very blessed. I think there's no nation in the world that takes its blessings more for granted than we do as Americans because we've had so many of them. It's just normal. It's natural. And a great example of that is our Constitution. You see, there's 5,800 years of recorded history. There's thousands of nations in that period of time. There's hundreds of constitutions in that period of time. Cornell University Law School said, what is the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? And they went over that 5,800 years and thousands of nations and hundreds of constitutions. And they said the average constitution throughout history has lasted 17 years. Just a month ago, we had Constitution Day, September 17th. We celebrated 235 years on the same piece of paper. Nobody in the world has come close to that number, and we just take it for granted. We so take it for granted that right now, we do a lot of national polling, and right now, national polling, you'll find that among college students, 75% want to get rid of the Constitution and go to socialism. 49% of millennials want to get rid of the Constitution and go to socialism. Now, you look at that and you look at those numbers, and you know, just as there's recorded history of thousands of nations, hundreds of constitutions, there's recorded history of thousands of nations and hundreds of socialistic nations. There's never been a single socialistic nation in history that has been able to preserve individual freedoms and keep national prosperity. It has never happened, not once. Well, it'll happen if we do it in America because anything we do succeeds. No, that's really stupid. If we put our hand on the stove, we're going to get burned like everybody else did. Because we're Americans doesn't keep us from getting burned. But you see, we know so little about who we are and so little about how special that we are that we don't protect the blessings we have. We're just willing to throw them away like, you know, Jacob and Esau. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of pottage. And that's essentially what happens when you don't understand how significant it is. So in addition to the stability that we enjoy, we also have amazing creativity. You see, America is 4% of the world's population. Now, 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of whatever. But when you look at inventions, and we can measure inventions by international copyright, patent protection, we can measure how many inventions have been done in and out of America. Right now, our 4% of the world's population has created more than 96% of the world's inventions. We're surrounded by stuff that we take for granted on a regular basis that everybody else wishes they could have access to. Same thing when you look at prosperity. The Constitution requires that every 10 years we do a census. We did the latest one in 2020. The results came out in 2021. According to census data, if you live in poverty in America, and we don't want anyone in America living in poverty, but if you live in poverty in America, census data shows that your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe, which is the second wealthiest place on the face of the earth. Wait a minute. Poverty in America is higher than middle class in Europe? Yep. That's why everybody in the world is lining up on our border, because if they can just come be poor in America, they've elevated their lifestyle higher than anything they've seen in their nation. So we don't understand the blessings we have. Now, the blessing, where do these come from? I mean, who are the leaders responsible for what we have? And would it be fair to say, well, the guys who gave us the Declaration and Constitution, that's a good starting spot. So the leaders responsible for what we enjoy today, how about George Washington? And folks like John Hancock would be another one. And then John Adams, same way. And these are all good choices. What I find interesting is John Adams in 1818 got a letter from a guy named Hezekiah Niles. Now, 1818, Adams is an old man. This is 42 years after he signed the Declaration of Independence. Hezekiah Niles is a young man. He would be a millennial of that generation. Hezekiah Niles told Adams, he says, I'm writing a book on the history of America. He says, and by the way, that book came out in 1822. We have it's called Principles and Acts of the American Revolution. But he said, I wasn't there when this stuff, and you were. And I want to get your perspective on it. He said, here we are today, and we enjoy so much of what you guys did. Where did you guys get your ideas? That's a great question. And so asking John Adams, who's responsible for these ideas, John Adams said, well, right up top, you've got the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. And then, of course, you've got the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, and don't forget the Reverend George Whitfield. Oh, you've got the Reverend Charles Johnson. Goes through and starts listing preachers. Now, these aren't the folks we would list today. And by the way, we, other than Whitfield, the chances that we know anything about Cooper or Mayhew or Chauncey is slim to none. See, we don't study preachers today, whether they're white or black. I mean, who in the world is Richard Allen, and who's Absalom Jones, and who's John Morant, and who's Lemuel Haynes, or even Harry Hoosier? And Harry Hoosier is a good example. Harry Hoosier was part of the Great Awakenings. Now, back in the Great Awakenings, you think about the great preachers back then, it's George Whitfield. It's John and Charles Wesley. It's Francis Asbury. We've got all these great preachers, and these guys, at a time when America's population was only 3 million, they would get 20 or 30,000 people out in a pasture and speak to them all at once. Just amazing stuff that they did. And Francis Asbury, who was one of those great leaders, he said, Harry draws larger crowds than we do. Never heard of Harry Hoosier. And then Benjamin Rush, who's a signer of the Declaration, out of the 250 folks we call founding fathers, John Adams said the 3 most notable founding fathers, number 1 was George Washington, number 2 is Ben Franklin, number 3 is Benjamin Rush. We know nothing about him today. I'll show you more about him later. Benjamin Rush said, I attend Harry's meetings, and Harry's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Wait a minute, you're running around with Patrick Henry? And Harry's better than, yeah, Harry's the best orator I've ever heard. Harry's ministry was largely the blue-collar folks, the woodsmen, the hunters, the trappers. These guys, they fought a lot, they cussed a lot, they drank a lot. And as they got converted, their behavior changed. They didn't drink as much or fight as much or cuss as much, but they still loved the outdoors and they still loved the woods. And they're what we would call long hunters. A long hunter is someone who would go out deer hunting and come back about 8 months later having found 2 more states somewhere. I mean, they just wander around and just always looking for stuff. And so that's what these guys were. And so Harry's ministry was, interestingly, was along the East Coast. He was over in Philadelphia, Delaware, and Jersey, in that area. But what happened is America started moving toward the west. And by the time you get to 1806, 1807, 1808, we've gone pretty far west. And all these woodsmen guys are going west with America because that's what they love. They love opening new area. And so they were all out west. But they had a little issue when they got west because these guys that are trappers looked at these converts of Harry and they said, they sure act really different. What's up with those guys? They're a bunch of those Hoosiers. Now, It was the Indiana Territory, of course. And, Indiana's named after a black evangelist? I wonder how many schools teach that. Not many that I've seen. Certainly not outside of Indiana do we see this. Isn't it interesting that you would think that if a state was named after a guy, he might show up in a history book somewhere? And by the way, I love your State History Society website. They give 4 options for where the name might have come from, and the other 3 are just almost ridiculous. There was a bar fight that went on the state lines, and after it was over, somebody's ear had been bit off in the fight, and somebody set it up and said, "Whose ear?" And that's where you got your name, Hoosier. How about named after the guy who is Hoosier? You know, it's like we do everything to not acknowledge that, but nonetheless, so Harry Hoosier is typical of what we see back then that we don't know, but today we're told, all the American founding, they're a bunch of white guys. I look at that, you're right, that's a bunch of white guys. And by the way, how do we know what they look like? Because there weren't any photographs back then. And this painting was painted in 1821 after most of these guys had been dead for a long time. So when John Trumbull painted this in 1821, how did he know what they looked like? Maybe he made it all up. Now here's the deal. Back in that time with no cameras, no pictures, it took money to have a painting done, but they would spend the money if someone had done something really significant. If he was a general, if he was a governor, if he had done the Declaration or Constitution. So what happened in 1821, John Trumbull just gathered up all the portraits of these guys and used the portraits to paint the painting. The painting is massive. It's a 14-foot high, 20-foot wide painting. It hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. It's life-size, and he painted it off of that. And so what happens is, if you're really significant, you get a painting done. Yeah, it's a bunch of white guys. How come we don't talk about all the paintings of all the black guys that are there? Because these are equally significant paintings guys who did equally significant stuff, got their paintings done. We just don't even know who they are today. I mean, just as an example, you take over here, Jack Sisson, probably the first SEAL team member back before we had SEAL teams, 1777, or Benjamin Banneker, or Richard Allen, or Peter Salem, the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Harry Hoosier, or right here, John Chavez in North Carolina, Lemuel Haynes, first black man to receive a degree or higher education, James Armistead, George Washington, Lafayette said he's the reason we won the American Revolution. We don't talk about him anymore, or Prince Estabrook, the Battle of Lexington. Go through all these guys. They're all significant. Example, this guy right here on horseback, this guy on horseback is named Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell is New Hampshire. He was elected to office in 1768. A black guy elected in a white community, 1768, yep. And he's a founding father of New Hampshire. He was reelected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions, started the school system in New Hampshire, as a historian of New Hampshire. We know what happened up there because the 3-volume set, the history of New Hampshire, Jeremy Belknap, he provided the information. He's a really important guy, and he made a Paul Revere ride across New Hampshire saying the British are coming. Same thing that Revere did down in Massachusetts. But he's certainly not the first black elected in America. You go back to 1641, and you have a guy named Matthias de Souza who's elected by the white community in Maryland, and he serves, a black man serving in the Maryland legislature in 1641. Well, by the time you get to the American Revolution, there have been hundreds of blacks serving in office. And by the time you get to the Civil War, by the end of the Civil War, by the end of Reconstruction, there have been thousands of blacks serving in office. We have black 2-star generals in the war. If you look up on Wikipedia today and say, who's the first black general? Benjamin Davis, 1968 in Vietnam. No, let's go to Robert Smalls back in 1868 in South Carolina. We don't know these guys today. So what happens is, with all these things that we don't know from history, take all these black elected officials. When was the first black elected to office in Great Britain? 1987. When's the first black elected to office in Russia? 2010. We're electing blacks to office in 1641, and we're the most racist nation in the history of the world. There's nobody worse than America. You can say that if you don't know your history. If you don't know your history, you can talk about critical. How come we didn't teach critical race theory 30 years ago? Because we knew our history too well. We knew these guys, but we don't know them anymore. And so, oh yes, there's been racial problems. Why? Because people are involved. As long as you got people, you're going to have problems. But what we always did was we taught the good and the bad and the ugly. Today we teach the bad and the ugly, none of the good, and we even make up a bunch of bad and ugly that didn't even happen. But that's because we're historically illiterate. And so being historically illiterate, it's not a good place to be, but that's what's happened in the nation. So going back and looking at America, we've been very blessed. Why? It's interesting that if you go back to textbooks used throughout our history, the first textbook printed in America was 1690 in Boston. We have that textbook. We have textbooks used for the next several centuries. And if you go through the textbooks, they consistently say, students, the reason America is different from all other nations is because of the Bible. It's the Bible that's made us different. Now, it'd be very tough for most Christians today to defend such a statement. There's a lot of ways you can defend it. I'm going to show you several, but let me just start with one. The way we talk to one another is shaped by the Bible. We have what we call idioms. We use idioms, little phrases we throw back and forth. We have 257 idioms that we use on a daily basis that are direct quotes out of the Bible. Americans quote the Bible to each other every day without recognizing it because we, again, don't know the Bible that well. But these are all things you've heard or said, by the skin of your teeth, or I'll give you my 2 cents worth. Leopard can't change his spots. There's nothing new in it. Every one of these is a Bible verse, every single one of them. And we use these on a daily basis. You hear them all the time, back and forth. As a matter of fact, one of the things I love doing, I did it just last night, was listening to a sportscaster last night. And we use these idioms all the time. And so I'll send a note back to the office, which I did last night. And I said, at this point in time, this guy talked, and he said this Bible verse on this story. And so we keep records of what I hear. And just over the last 4 years, I will tell you, hands down, the single national network that has quoted the Bible more than any other network is ESPN. Now, they don't have a clue that they've ever quoted a Bible verse. And if they knew, they would instantly stop. But, you know, go back to 4 years ago. They announced LeBron James is going to the Lakers. He's going to take the Lakers to the promised land. That didn't happen, obviously. What's this promised land thing? Oh, that's the Bible. They don't have a clue. And so the way we talk to one another, if you don't have a lot of fun, next time you go to Walmart or Home Depot or you go to McDonald's or gas station, you're going to hear somebody use one of these Bible verses. And you ought to stop them and say, hey, do you know what Bible verse you just quoted? Now, they're going to look at you like you're crazy, and they're going to say, no, I don't have a clue. What Bible verse was that? And you won't have a clue either. I mean, we don't know where this stuff came from. Every one of these has an address. If you look up all of these addresses, you will find those phrases. See, we quote the Bible all the time to each other. We just don't recognize that we do. The Bible has shaped the way we talk to one another. If you go to John Quincy Adams, I think he describes well where we are today. He says, with regard to the history contained in the Bible, it's not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it. You see, if you had known those 257 images, we would praise you and say, oh, wow, what a Bible scholar you are. We would praise you today for knowing the Bible. Back in their day, they would say, wait a minute, you didn't know this stuff came out of the Bible? Shame on you. How can you call yourself an educated person and not know the greatest book in the history of the world? So what was shameful back then has become praiseworthy today. That's that shift that we've seen, that we're not as biblical even as Franklin was back in that day. Another president, this is Zachary Taylor. I'm just going to use presidents for the next few minutes because it surprises many Americans to find that for 170 years, it was the presidents of the United States who were all the time telling Americans, we can't survive without the Bible. The Bible is what made America. And this is presidents saying that. You can imagine what would happen today if any president said it today. It doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Biden, either one. If either one of them made that comment, they'd be torn to pieces. And look what President Zachary Taylor said, war hero. His nickname is Old Rough and Ready. He says, the Bible is the best of books. I wish it were in the hands of everyone. It's indispensable to the safety and permanence of our institutions. Not our faith, our institutions. Yeah. See, here's another interesting thing. When you look at economic systems in the world, there's a number of different economic systems. America has the free market system. We don't have command economies or the other different systems. We have a free market system. And you'll find that in the modern world, we're the first ones to implement that. 1627 in Massachusetts, because in Europe at the time, every nation was socialistic. The king owned everything, the state owned everything. We would let you use it. We would give you what you needed. You give it all to the king. He'll distribute it the way he thinks it should be distributed. Everybody's socialistic. So when the Pilgrims came here, they were socialists when they got here. When the Jamestown colony came here, they were socialists when they got here. And it's interesting, their own governors record the change. And for example, when you're at Jamestown, or when you're at Plymouth, Governor William Bradford said, we had been socialists, and he said, as if we were wiser than God. But see, what happened in Plymouth was they spent several hours a day in the Bible. It was a brand new book. It had been put up for more than a millennial. You would get yourself killed if you tried to read the Bible for nearly 1,000 years. It came out in English in 1560, and a lot of people died just to get it done in English. But when it came out, they started reading it and said, man, we haven't been doing this. This is so different from what we've been doing for 1,000 years. And so when they get to America, Bradford says that they would spend 4, 6, 8 hours a day reading the scriptures because it's a brand new book. It's a different way of life. Everything is different in it. And he said that they found 1 Timothy 5:8. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, if you don't provide for your own household, you're worse than an infidel. You've denied the faith. He said, whoa, we've been providing for everybody else's household. We're going to provide for our own household? Suddenly, then you've got an incentive to provide. And he said that within 3 years, their prosperity, their productivity went up 7-fold in just 3 years. Apatuck, Massachusetts is the first place to have a free market business, and that was 1627. So you find that's a Bible verse, but you find in Virginia they were having the same trouble, and Governor John Smith reminded them of 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Because in Virginia, they weren't working. They were waiting for the king to send the supplies, and they're starving to death. They literally went through what they call the starving time. About 80% of the population starved to death waiting for food to arrive. They didn't do nothing themselves. They're just waiting for it to come because that's what socialism does. And he read to them out of 2 Thessalonians 3:10 that says, if you don't work, you don't eat. That's the new law in Jamestown. And you're going to work, and a lot of them said, I'm not working, I'm waiting for the king to send stuff. They literally took a whip and had to whip people to start getting them to work to save their own lives. I mean, that's how lazy we had become. And so if you look at the free market system, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, 1 Timothy 5:8, Matthew 25, Luke 19, and Matthew 20 are the 5 Bible verses that built the free market system that America's used since 1627. That's an institution. That's not our faith, that's our institution. Every American has benefited from that system. You don't have to be a Christian to benefit from biblical values. I don't think Franklin was a Christian in any way, shape, fashion, or form. The last writing he did on his religious faith was 3 months before he died, and he was not a Christian at that point. Maybe he became one later. But even Franklin used the Bible like crazy because it produced the best culture, the best society. We understood that. You don't have to be a Christian to be in a Christian nation. Christian principles provide something that everybody wants. He continued. He said, especially should the Bible be placed in the hands of the young, it is the best school book in the world. I would that all of our people were brought up under the influence of that holy book. Best school book in the world? That's unconstitutional. You can't do that. Yeah, we did. Back here you have Ulysses S. Grant. He was the president in 1876. Ulysses S. Grant was there for the centennial of America. So he came out with this card, 1776, birth of America, 1876, centennial, and that's why it says centennial here. It says, message of President Grant to the children and youth of the United States, and here's his message. I'll put it up in larger letters. He says, hold fast to the Bible as the sheet anchor of your liberties. To the influence of this book, we're indebted for all the progress made in true civilization, and to this we must look as our guide in the future. That's his message to the young people of America. If you want this thing to last, the Bible is the only way it's going to do it. This is the President of the United States. You see, this is what we had for so long, and going back to Benjamin Rush, I told you he's one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. Let me credential him for a minute. Signed the Declaration, ratified the Constitution, served in 3 different presidential administrations. He's the most famous physician in American history. To this day, he's called the father of American medicine. He trained the first black physicians. He also started 5 universities. He also started academic education for women. He also started the first abolition society, became the national leader of the national abolition movement. He also started the first Bible society in America. He started the Sunday school movement in America. The guy's unbelievable what he did. And just go through his credentials. And he's called the father of public schools under the Constitution because of a piece he did in 1790. He said, you know, we've been 13 nations for a long time. Now we're one nation. What do we need to teach in schools to remain a nation? Then after he did that in 1790, in 1791, he came out with a piece called The Use of the Bible in Schools. And in this piece in 1791, he said, here's a dozen reasons we will never take the Bible out of public schools in America. Here's a dozen reasons the Bible will always be the basis of public education. And this is one of the things he pointed out. He said, the great enemy of the salvation of man, in my opinion, never invented a more effectual means of extinguishing Christianity from the world than by persuading mankind that it was improper to read the Bible at schools. Now, it's interesting how many Christians I talk to today say, oh, no, we shouldn't have the Bible in public schools. If you want the Bible in schools, have a Christian school. Bible in public schools. This is the best book for freedom, best book for economics, best book for self-government, best book for medicine, best book for everything. And that's why we would never take it out of schools. We're too smart to take it out of schools. Significantly, we have a case in 1844 at the U.S. Supreme Court called Vidal versus Girard's Executors. It came out of the state of Pennsylvania. There was a school in Philadelphia, a government-run, government-operated school that said, we don't think we're going to teach the Bible anymore. That case went to the Supreme Court because they're not teaching the Bible. And at the U.S. Supreme Court, in an 8-0 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, wait a minute. If you're a government-run, government-operated school, you will teach the Bible. We're not going to fund any school that won't teach the Bible. If you don't want to teach the Bible, go be a private school. You can do what you want over there. But if it's going to be a public, U.S. Supreme Court. Now, by the way, you all got that in your history books when you went through school, right? You all saw that? No, what we see is what came out in 1963. 1963 in Abilene, Champaign, Murray, Corlett. This is the first time in America's history that they took the Bible out of schools. They took the Bible out. Why would they take the Bible out of schools if we have all this earlier stuff? I've been involved in 13 cases U.S. Supreme Court. I was involved in a case this year. We're already involved in a case for next term at the Supreme Court. And if you want to know why the court does what it did, why did the court say you can't have the Bible in schools? Go back and read the court decision. And if you go back and read the court decision, you will find that this court said taking the Bible out of public schools, they said, was without legal or historical precedent. And that's a big admission. What we're doing right now is pure, raw judicial activism. There's no historical or legal reason for taking the Bible. Then why did you take it out? Read the decision. They said if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. In all your great wisdom, you think the Bible causes brain damage. May I suggest that we've suffered massive brain damage since we've taken the Bible out of schools? And I'm a cowboy from Texas, got the ranch, got the horses and the cattle and the pickup and everything that goes with it, love being a cowboy. You may not like cowboys, you may not know anything about that life at all. It does not matter. I can take you to the ranch in Texas. I can put you behind my cattle herd, and every single one of you can tell me the gender of every critter that I've got in that cattle herd. And you will find that there are only two genders. You're going to say, oh, there's a male and there's a female. Bible says, and God made them male and female. 4 times it says that. Last month in corporate training, LGBTQIA+ movement does a lot of corporate training. And last month they pointed out to all the corporate leaders that there's now 150 different genders in America. That's serious brain damage. Okay? So this is where the nonsense really gets started, is back because, and see, the other thing that Benjamin Rush pointed out about this, Benjamin Rush said, the Bible contains more knowledge necessary to man in his present state than any book in the world. I'll give you 3 examples. This guy's named Matthew Maury. He was born in 1806. He grew up listening to speeches of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, etc. He loved the sea, and he joined the Navy. He went to sea as a midshipman in the Navy. He became an officer in the Navy, became a captain in the Navy, became one of the best captains in the Navy. And one day he was ashore, and he was in a stagecoach with 12 other people, 13 in the stagecoach, and that stagecoach slipped off an embankment and rolled down the hill. Everybody's fine except him. It crushed his leg, broke his hip, broke all sorts of stuff. And it never grew back right. Given the medicine back then, it never got back right. So he could never go back to sea because he couldn't keep his balance. But he loved the sea. It was his passion. So he heads naval research, does all this naval research on the sea. And it's interesting that he is called the father of oceanography because he's the guy who discovered that there are jet streams in the ocean. That if you will move your ship over here about 2 miles, you'll get to Europe in half the time everybody else does. And by the way, think about the technology back then. How did you know there were jet streams in the ocean? And by the way, if you doubt that there are jet streams in the ocean, just watch Finding Nemo. Really easy. You'll see the jet streams in the ocean. How did he find the jet streams in the ocean? How did he map them? Now, this is a big chart. When you look at his charts, I mean, every 2 or 3 miles, he has where the jet streams are and how you get in those streams. And what he did with that, coming out with that chart, and what he did, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but what he did when he came out with that chart, it cut travel time in half. And so now, as a shipping guy, you can get twice as many trips in, means you bring twice as much back, twice as much you can sell. Your prosperity goes up, but now that you're bringing more back, prices go down because supply and demand. So when prices go down, there's more income left over. So the prosperity of the nations just started rising, just exponentially, as a result of what happened with this map. Now, how in the world did he come up with that, given the technology of that day? In his autobiography, he tells us, he said that he was home sick one day, and he asked his family to read the Bible out loud to them, and they did. And it was particularly Psalm 8 that caught his attention. It says, Lord, thou madest man to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, and the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea, and whatever passes through the paths of the sea. He said, whoa, read that again. And he had him read it over and over because it said, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. I've been on the sea my whole life. I've never seen paths of the sea. Read that again. And what he said, he wrote, he said, if God said there are paths in the sea, then there are paths in the sea, and I'm going to find them. And so that's what got him started on finding these pathways through the sea. Also, that's not the only verse that set him off and resulted in big changes for the rest of us. He points to what happened with Ecclesiastes 1:6. In Ecclesiastes 1:6, the Bible says, the wind goes toward the south and turns around toward the north. The wind whirls about continually and goes again on a circuit. There's a circuit for the wind? Really? And he found that, yep, there's a circuit, and it goes one way in one hemisphere, goes the opposite way in the other hemisphere. He was able to figure out the circuits of the wind, and as a result, he could predict weather. So he's called the father of naval meteorology. Now think about accurate weather prediction in the 1800s, 1840s and 50s. Are you kidding me? But he would say, hey guys, see the clouds there? Do not set sail this week. It's a really bad, I mean, he is unbelievable. He just revolutionized the whole world. Scientists today that study science, they consider him the most famous scientist in American history. Now, you haven't seen him in your textbooks, and there's a lot of monuments to him across America. And if you go to any of the monuments built to Matthew Maury, first off, we'll say, who's Matthew Maury? And the second thing we'll say, oh, look at that. By every statue, it always shows sitting beside him in every statue, it has the Bible, because that was the source of his scientific ideas. Now, I do a presentation I have on science. It's amazing how many guys back in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s made breakthroughs in science off specific Bible verses. Before we had any of the technology we had, we found all sorts of things like what he did. Jet streams in the air, jet streams in the ocean. Really? Yeah, Bible told him that. So that's one example. Another guy I would point to is a guy named James Kent. He's called the father of American jurisprudence. He and Joseph Story helped set up the jurisprudence system in America, judges. And one of the things we had back in the day was circuit courts. Now, we still have circuit courts in states. Every state has a circuit court. But go back to the original Supreme Court. You think of the Supreme Court today, there's the Fourth Circuit and the Third Circuit and the Seventh Circuit and the Eighth Circuit. And there's a Supreme Court justice over every circuit. Back in the day, you didn't go to Washington, D.C. for court. The judge went out to every state. So there's a judge that would leave from the Supreme Court, would go down to Georgia and ride all around Georgia holding all the cases. There was one that would ride over to New York and do all of New York. There was one that would ride down to Virginia, do all of Virginia. Those were circuit court judges, and that's what we had back then. Now, today we do it electronically. We still have the residuals of circuit courts, but this concept of circuit judges, that was really unusual. Try finding other nations doing that. How come we did it? Well, he says it came out of 1 Samuel 7, verses 15 and 16, where it says, and Samuel judged Israel, and Samuel rode the circuit from Gilgal to Mizpah to all the other towns. Oh, so Samuel's a judge, and he gets on his horse and he rides to all the people and goes to all the different towns and holds court in the towns. That's why we had circuit judges, came out of that passage. And if you go to Ben Franklin is the guy who created the first healthcare system in America, founded the first hospital in America, 1751. Why did he found the first hospital? On the logo that he created for the hospital, it cites Luke 10:35 as the reason for the first hospital in America. See, the Bible is the basis of so much of our institutions, not just our faith. It's what shaped our culture. It's what shaped so much. And so that's why Franklin Roosevelt said, in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised on the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident. Is it really? Is it conspicuously evident today? Now I will point out, this is a liberal progressive Democrat, and nobody questioned the Bible shaped everything we did. Nobody questioned that that was part of the textbooks. Nobody questioned that this is what we did. Nobody questioned that we had the Bible in schools. See, even on the opposite political side, he continues, he said, we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. There's no way you can talk about America being what she is without talking about the Bible unless you are an American today. And if you've been through American public education, Bible's got nothing to do with it, but that's not the way it had been. So when you look back to where we were then, John Quincy Adams, I used him earlier, John Quincy Adams wrote a book for 10-year-old Americans to show them how to read through the Bible from cover to cover once every year. He said, kids, this is what we all do in America. We read the Bible cover to cover once every year, and you need to know about this, and you need to do it too. So the President of the United States writes a book for 10-year-old Americans. And by the way, if you don't read the Bible cover to cover, let me encourage you to do that. Let me encourage you that 12 months from now, you're going to have finished the Bible, read it from cover to cover. This is what we did in America. This is what Franklin, everybody else, this is what happened. So he tells the 10-year-olds, he says, no book in the world deserves to be so unceasingly studied and so profoundly meditated on as the Bible. He says, I myself for many years have made it a practice to read the Bible once every year. We all do that. He says, and I've always endeavored to read with the same spirit which I now recommend to you. You're 10 years old. You need to be reading the Bible from cover to cover, and I'm going to recommend to you how you get the most out of your Bible reading. This is what I do. He says, I always read it with the intention and desire that it may contribute to my advance in wisdom and virtue. I don't read the Bible as a spiritual devotional book. I don't read it to get blessed. I read it to see what it will do to change my thinking, my wisdom, what it will do to change my behavior, my virtue. He went through the Bible at least 68 times, probably closer to 85 or 90. He went through it every year. He lived to be 80 years old. He kept a diary for 68 years, starting when he was 11 years old, and you'll find that he goes through it every year. And in addition to what the Lord shows him in his daily Bible readings, it's a lot of fun to read his diary, you'll also find that at the start of each year, he would take a theme and say, as I go through the Bible this year, here's what I'm looking for. And one year, as I go through the Bible this year, what I'm looking for is any Bible verse I can find on banking and finance. And that's what he searched for that year. Next year, I'm looking for any verse I can find on criminal justice and due process. And that's what he read for the year. So he's always taken a theme in addition to what he sees every day. And that was his goal. He said, kids, this is the way you need to read the Bible. Look at a practical book. And by the way, if you ever get in a federal court practicing law, you have what's called federal practice and procedure. It's dozens of volumes of how to practice law in federal courts. Different areas, different categories. You're practicing this kind of law or whatever. And it's interesting that in volume 30, and this I learned this first from Justice Stephen Breyer, who's one of the most secular justices of Supreme Court history. And the decision he wrote, he said, well, we all know that the due process rights all came out of the Bible. Do we really? He said so, and I thought, where is that? And due process rights is the 4th through the 8th Amendment, all these different rights. And so his footnote takes you to volume 30 of Federal Practice and Procedure. And in volume 30 of Federal Practice and Procedure, there's nearly 20 pages on the Bible verses that created the due process clauses. For example, the right to confront your accuser is Proverbs 18:17. The right to compel witnesses, the right to confront your accuser is John 8:10. The right to compel witnesses in your behalf is Proverbs 18:17. The right to testify in your own defense is Acts 22:1. I mean, this is federal practice and procedure, and they're quoting all the Bible verses that shape the due process and the Bill of Rights. I'd never seen that. It was in a federal law book. So this is what he's talking about. We always look for practical application with it. And significantly, that's what we saw in schools. Now, he was talking to 10-year-olds. That would be what we would call 3rd and 4th grade. All the states, including Indiana, when it was a territory, Indiana was a state, you have records on education in your state. The first education law passed for the Indiana Territory goes back to 1787. It was repassed in 1785. It was passed in 1787, repassed in 1789, signed by George Washington, August 1789, and it talked about what had to be done in education here. So you have records on education that date all the way back to territorial days, all the way through. Every state does. And so you can go read the public education records of any state. And I just want to show you, I just picked New Jersey for grins. So New Jersey, I want you to see what was happening in public schools in New Jersey in 1816. This is the report on public schools in New Jersey, 1816. Again, you can pick any state. 1816, this part of the report is talking about what we're doing in the 1st and 2nd grades. So 1st and 2nd grades, it says, all the scholars of the 1st and 2nd classes commit to memory portions of the New Testament or Psalms, a lesson of the Catechism, several hymns, and the text of the preceding Sabbath. All the first and second graders are memorizing this. What are the texts of the preceding Sabbath? Now, whatever Micah talked about in church on Sunday, we're going to memorize all those Bible verses during the week. Really? So, we're talking public schools here, right? Now, you're always going to have some kids that are faster than other kids, no question about it. And they talked about one of the kids who was really a sharp kid. It says, one of the scholars who committed to memory the book of John and the first 30 Psalms together with the 119th Psalm. First and second grader has done that? Yeah, but he's a smart one. The others aren't that smart. The others, it says the majority have committed to memory the gospel by John. So all the first and second graders have memorized the Gospel of John, but we have one kid that added 30 chapters of Psalms and Psalm 119, but everybody does the Gospel of John. I don't know a single Christian I've met who's memorized the Gospel of John. And this is second grade, first grade, public schools in New Jersey. This is what we did in America for years, and I can show you state after state after state. This is common stuff. I just got a book that actually has the laws of all the states, I think in 1865, which is 36 states or 38 states, and all the states. This is what we did. So this is common stuff, but today we don't do that, and that's where we have a real biblical literacy. This is what affects our politics. Because you see, when you look at God's institutions, most of us will agree that God created three institutions. God created the family. The families in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. You have Adam, you have Eve, you have children. God said this is good. God ordained the family. God ordained civil government, and the way God ordained civil government, you remember that Cain killed Abel and started the rampage on the earth. I mean, the rape and the pillage and the plunder and the murder and the theft, and God says, let's just wipe it out and start again. So here came the flood. Noah and his family get off the ark, and God says, we're not going to do this anymore. And he gave Noah what are called the Noahide laws in Genesis 9. In Genesis 9, he gave him 7 laws that institute civil government. The first law says, Noah, here's what's to be done with murderers. Here's what's to be done with thieves. This is the second law. And it goes through the 7 laws, and they're civil laws. So God ordained civil government. That is his institution. He created it. There is no record of any government existing prior to that with Noah, either in secular records or in religious records. Noah's the first government in the history of the world, and God gave it to him. And then we know that God ordained the church, and that's really in the book of Exodus. That's a type and shadow, because Exodus, you have the congregation, you have the tabernacle, the people gather together and assemble, and God gives all the instructions, and so that's the type and shadow of the church. We know that these 3 are God's institutions, and Christians pretty aware of family and church, not necessarily aware of government. But we were in the previous years when we studied the Bible all the time. If you go back to the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, it's striking that the single work cited most often in the era of independence was a work by John Locke called The Two Treatises of Government. Matter of fact, Richard Henry Lee is the founding father who made the motion that we separate from Great Britain, which resulted in the Declaration of Independence. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He said, quote, we copied the Declaration out of Locke's Two Treatises on Government. Now, this is a document on civil government, and it's less than an inch thick, less than 400 pages long. I have the original, but they've reprinted it. It's available. You can see it, read it online. You can get a book. It references the Bible more than 1,500 times to show the proper operation of civil government. So why would you say that government's secular? Because we hear that all the time. We hear leaders say, oh, government's secular. God didn't deal with that. Then what do you do with 1,500 references? Just because we're biblically illiterate today doesn't mean God didn't reference that. And we knew that back at a period of time when we really studied the Bible more. So what happens today is we're not necessarily very good on all 3 institutions. We do more here and here than we do here. And that's being a 2/3 Christian. It's like, I like 2 of the 3 institutions, I don't like the other. We really can't do that. You can't leave government out of it, and that's what a lot of Christians today do. We need to be 3/3 Christians. God has clear instructions in all of these areas, and so we have to be engaged in all of these areas. Now, as you talk about being engaged in these areas, going back to Benjamin Rush, I told you, he's called the father of public schools under the Constitution because the piece he wrote in 1790. I showed you the 1791 piece. Here's the 1790 piece. It's called On the Mode of Education Proper in a Republic. Now that we're a republic, we're no longer 13 nations, we're one. What do we have to teach in our public schools to stay a nation? And so he goes through and lists it. And he says the purpose of public education is threefold. He said the number one purpose of public education in America is to teach students to love and serve God. He said the number two purpose of public education in America is to teach students to love and serve their country. He said the number three purpose of public education in America is to teach students to love and serve their family. Now, if you look at that, nearly every Christian I know would object to that and say, no. It should be God, and then it should be family, and then it should be country, because family is so much more important. And he says, no, you're wrong. It should be God, it should be country, and it should be family, because he pointed out that if you ever lose control of your country will become the great enemy of the family, which is what we're seeing right now. If you didn't see it on Monday, last Monday, a week ago now, the law just passed in California, signed by the governor, Newsom signs bill that removes children from parents who oppose transgender treatments. You'll lose your kids. The state will take your kids if you oppose transgender. The state is the enemy of the family. And this is where so much of the stuff is coming from, and it's because we don't control the state anymore. We lost control of it. We're not engaged in that arena, and that's what we have to get back into. So we've got to be involved in that countryside, and this is what we're seeing with schools, even schools that we thought were rural schools pretty good. We're finding out that, man, this is a cesspool of problems here. Even the rural schools have all these books in the libraries that, we wouldn't admit anywhere, and gender transition closets, really? And all this stuff going on? Yeah, it's going on, and that's why we're seeing people run for school boards in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. Now, running for school boards means local elections, and as you look at local elections, stats are pretty interesting. To vote in America, there's three requirements: 2 constitutional requirements, 1 statutory requirement. The 2 constitutional requirements are you got to be 18 years old and you got to be a legal citizen. If you can do that, 100% of 18-year-olds who are legal citizens can vote. The statutory requirement says you have to register to vote. That way we make sure you don't vote 7 times or somebody doesn't vote 7 times for you. Statutory requirements where it breaks down. Only 65.3% of adult Americans are registered to vote. We have roughly 100 million Americans who've said, I don't care what happens to the nation, I ain't going to be part of it at all. That includes 40 million evangelical Christians who have not even registered to vote. Do you know how different the country might look today if we had that 40 million being salt and light and that civil? No, but we don't do politics. You haven't read the Bible, because if you read the Bible, particularly if you read Hebrews 11, that Faith Hall of Fame, look at how many people God holds up our heroes that were involved in government. I mean, just take Daniel and go through Moses and go through all those folks. And so what happens here, when you look at this 65%, there's two different voting cycles we have. The first is where we have the highest voter turnout for presidential elections. In the last 11 presidential elections, the average voter turnout is 54% of registered voters vote. But that's not 54% of adults, that's 54% of 65.3%, which means 36% of adults actually vote for president. It takes half of that to win, which is 18%. The other type of election is what we're having this year. It's an off-year election. In off-year elections, we elect our governors and our U.S. senators and our state legislators and federal legislators. For the last 21 off-year elections, the average voter turnout has been 38%. But that's 38% of 65%, which is 26% that actually vote for that, and takes half of that to win. So what you're looking at is in the last 11 presidential elections, 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States. 4 out of 5 Americans did not choose the President in the last 11 elections. When it gets to governors and senators and legislators, it's 1 out of 8 Americans that chooses our governors, senators, and legislators. 7 out of 8 did not choose them. So we have a very non-involved, unparticipatory process right now by our own choice. And when you get to the local elections, it's usually only about a 6% turnout, but that's 6% of registered voters, which is 4% of actual voters, and it takes half of that to win. Let me give you an example. If you go to Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States. Los Angeles, the population of the city of Los Angeles is larger than the population of 23 separate individual states. So if you're Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, that's like being a governor in 23 states. And Eric Garcetti, man, is he faith hostile. Remember COVID? Shut everything down, didn't shut anything down except the churches. Churches, they're the ones that have to go. We can't have churches. They're definitely non-essential. All the rest of the stuff is. I mean, he's been faith hostile, and he brags about the fact he was elected mayor of Los Angeles with a 2.9% of the vote. I know enough churches in Los Angeles, they could have anybody they wanted for mayor. But they've got a guy who hates them. And you have the same thing that happened in Houston. Houston's the 4th largest city in the nation. It's larger in population of 20 states. and they elected Anise Parker as mayor with 3.3% of the vote. She's the first open lesbian mayor of Houston. She said, you know, I just got a law passed in city that if you say marriage between a man and a woman, that is now a hate crime, and I've got you. And if you say that, and she went after pastors all over the city. There's enough churches in Houston, they can have anybody they want to for mayor. And that's what they had because they didn't do anything, get involved, and now they're involved in these lawsuits, et cetera. So you look at local elections. Chad mentioned what happened in Virginia. There's tens of thousands of churches in Virginia, and Faith Wins got involved there, and 312 churches out of tens of thousands. He mentioned they found in the pews 77,000 people who had never registered, never voted, and none of them were large churches. They were all community churches, no, not mega churches. So you found in there 77,000 people never registered, they voted, and as he pointed out, Youngkin wins by 64,500. Next thing is 2 Timothy 2:5 says, no one can be crowned a winner unless they run according to the rules. What are the rules of elections? Don't have a clue. That's where 1,343 said, we want to learn. And they got involved, and those 1,343, 300 state certified election officials, 1,043 were poll watchers, and they identified 5.2% of the vote as being fraudulent. Now, if you take Chad mentioned 17 people in a cow pasture, not even a structure there. If you take 5.2% fraudulent off, you'll win a whole lot of elections if you take 5.2% fraudulent vote out. And we're doing this in states across the nation. As a matter of fact, as you go to Michigan just last week, we heard in Michigan with all we're doing there in voter integrity stuff, just having eyes on the process. You know, we're told to be salt and light. And light is just shining light, just letting it be seen. And just simply being in the room where votes are being counted, it's amazing. In Virginia, when poll watchers stepped into 3 county clerks, 3 different counties, 3 county clerks resigned from office just because someone was going to be watching what they were doing. That kind of says something, you know, so just be in light, just show up. Maybe you don't see anything, great. Maybe you solved everything because they're not going to do it while you're watching. So what happened at Faith Wins in Michigan, we found a guy named Jason Daniel who voted twice in 2020. Now that's not good, but that's definitely not the story. Jason Daniel was born in 1850, a Civil War vet. We're going to Michigan tonight. I've never met anyone 172 years old. I'm looking forward to meeting a guy at 172 years old. So this, voting twice, but you see, it's interesting up in Michigan, the Secretary of State is suing to keep all the dead people on the rolls. At this point, there are more than 20,000 people on the rolls who have been dead for more than 20 years. Take them off. No, that's a good 40,000 votes. Can't take those off. It's crazy. And this is nothing new. Don't think that this is something that we're facing our generation. This is Harper's Weekly picture from back in 1864. Harper's Weekly, there's people getting the names off of tombstones so they can vote in the next election. Dead people have been voting for a long time in America. There is fraud every single election that happens because people are involved, and there's always people who think the end justifies the means, the Machiavellian philosophy. That's why Christians have to be involved in every single one of these things. So looking at it, let me show you some local headlines. Canada's opposing critical race theory, COVID-19 mandates win Minnesota school board. Minnesota is not a conservative place at all, and yet churches got involved in Minnesota and took school boards all over Minnesota. I love this one out of New Jersey. 19-year-old who saw a senior year disrupted by COVID shutdowns unseats the incumbent in school board race. So this kid lost his senior year and said, I'm running against you. You're not going to do that to me. He beat the incumbent by 17 points. And I will point out it is really nice to finally have some adults on the school board in New Jersey. It's really good. This is Denver. This one, Colorado Springs. There's 4 school boards in Colorado Springs. 1,500 churches got together in Colorado, took 78 school boards. They took the Denver, that is hardcore, secular, progressive blue. And now solid Christians have the school board in Denver. Think what that means for hundreds of thousands of kids who will have a different approach to what they're being taught and what they're not going to be taught. Same thing, took all 4 school boards in Colorado Springs. Those are the 2 largest cities in the state. Again, churches got involved. Same thing in Wichita, 3 out of 4 in Wichita. Up here in Treasure Valley, that's Boise. That's the craziest city in Idaho. Churches got involved, took the school board in Boise. Dallas, 51 churches got together in Dallas. There were 15 school board positions in Dallas, and they won all 15. They got 15 out of 15 in Dallas. Dallas is, they're from Texas, but they're the crazy part of Texas. They are and we've got the school board in Dallas now, and that's a massive city. Same thing in Houston. 2.3 million people in Houston. Churches got together in Houston, took all the school board seats. 2.3 million people in Houston, and they took the school board seats, average of only 5,000 votes cast in a school board seat. There's individual churches down there with 10 to 15,000. Getting Christians involved, took all sorts of things in Houston. Same thing in Fort Worth. They took 20 out of 21 seats in Fort Worth. Churches got together. Fort Worth, the same, just a month ago. Miami-Dade County, they got 25 out of 30 school board seats in Miami-Dade County. See, Christians are starting to show up again, and this is going to make a difference in the nonsense that we've been teaching for the last 20 years that most of us weren't even aware was being taught for the last 20 years, and it's now coming out. So this is what we're seeing all over the nation. And so as you look at things like this, the challenge is we've got to become 3/3 Christians. We've got to get back in this arena. We got to help our brethren understand that this is not a secular arena. God is over all of this. He's got specific instructions on how government's supposed to work. And that's, again, why I encourage every one of us, we need to really get back into reading the Scripture on a daily basis. We need that kind of food that we had in previous generations that helped us to think right about so many issues. And Bible memory, maybe someday we can be as smart as a first grader in New Jersey, know as much of the Bible in New Jersey. But we really do need to get back to these as institutions, as the things that we do to turn these institutions around. So if this is new to you, we've got a book on the back table back there called The American Story, which goes through all this kind of history. The Founder's Bible actually goes through all the various Bible verses that were used to build the institutions in America, the culture of America. So you're welcome to see that at the back. Chad, up to you, bro.
Y'all give David a hand. Now, I realize y'all knew most of that. I get it. You want to get the Founder's Bible is phenomenal. We bought the leather edition for all 4 of our kids for Christmas, going to have their name put on it. The American Story, just finished my second reading. Short little chapters. Read it to your kids. Read it to your grandkids. They're not getting this stuff, y'all. They are not hearing this. No wonder there's so many America haters out there. If all they hear is just bad, it's bad, it's bad. Here's the other thing I want to tell you, and I don't know if my mic's on. I turned it on here, y'all, but I don't know if it's on wherever. I got a green light, so I don't know if it's on back there or not, but I got a big mouth according to my wife and kids. When we started working in Virginia, we didn't have an electoral outcome desire. It was the same thing we've been doing was Christians, wake up, get involved, and all my political buddies in D.C. mocked me. They said, what are you doing in Virginia? You can't make a difference. It's too far gone. It's a liberal state. It's a blue state. It had become an experimentation station for the school boards, for the legislature. I mean, how do you pass a law to let babies die comfortably? Seriously. How wicked can you be? And yet they did it. And so we just did our deal. We had 7 pastors that met in a room in January 2021. Micah knows this story. I told this story in Dallas. 7 pastors that I just said, look, I'm going to pay your expenses. I'm going to have Chick-fil-A sandwich meals. I'll fund that. Then I'm going to bring David and Cheryl around. We'll go to bigger meetings. Y'all go talk. Can you find 10 pastors who've never heard this message? That is all I said 1,000 times, over and over and over and over and over. 312 churches. And I like David said, I don't think any were mega churches. When it got down to it, you would not believe if I had gotten between most of the political hacks and a television camera, I'd have been injured. Because they all want to take credit. And I had a donor, the governor there gave my cell phone number to some people in the state called New Jersey. Y'all heard about it? It's the People's Republic pretty much. And I went and did a Jewish meeting with 17 rabbis and 30 other Jewish leaders in a kosher restaurant in Lakewood, New Jersey. And the key rabbi is a direct descendant of Aaron. Nathan, that's like the Aaron. Y'all with me? The guy has always voted secularly and for the left and all that kind of thing. The governor of New Jersey singled him out as he wouldn't close the synagogues. He was like, we have a mandate to meet and assemble and worship the Lord. The police officers came and pulled him down by his beard to the concrete. A young rabbi showed me the video, and he came up and said, you know, we're not voting that way anymore, Chad. I like what you're talking about. And we didn't tell them who to vote for, how to vote. But one of the people, when they flew me up to New Jersey, I met with some donors. They said, why do you think you guys deserve credit for Virginia? I said, look here, man. I was fine in South Carolina. It's warmer there. You call me. We don't care about the credit. We're losing our country, y'all. We're losing our country to people. They hate you, but they really hate him. That's what this is about. They hate truth, they hate him, and they cannot stand it. Instead of having some honorable debate and civil discourse, no. They got to shut you out. I believe God's given us a chance to reemerge. And that whole 10 months in Virginia, we're trying to duplicate that in a lot of states. It's not about a party. It's not about a politician. It's certainly not about a personality. It's about you and me not quitting and reemerging and inserting ourselves back into the culture so that when you're sitting around a room, I tell people, if my mama or my two grandmamas had been in the room when some knucklehead said, ooh, what a great idea. If a boy feels like a girl today, he should go to the bathroom with the girls. You know, you can feel like a doorknob, and that doesn't change the truth. But my mama and my grandmamas would have grabbed a chair and whopped somebody upside the head with that stupid comment. This is insanity. And that's just a piece of the insanity. I told a media person the other day, Christians care about more than life, and they care about more than marriage. They care these drugs coming across the border, and they care about terrorism, and they care about the Middle East being in disarray. They care about international wars. They care about human trafficking. We should care about all this stuff. Dr. Falwell said in the 80s, our problem is we win, we quit, we lose, we quit. Y'all, we got to quit quitting. Quit quitting. We're not looking for a perfect candidate. I know so many Christians, well, this candidate does this candidate does that. You know, I get it. I had one the other day as a Senate candidate came up and asked me my personal opinion. Well, he paid for an abortion. Okay, let's say he did. He says he didn't. Let's say he did. He paid for an abortion with his money. This other candidate wants to pay for all abortions with your money. We got to think again. That's what David's talk teaches us, to think again. Look, we need your help. And if it hadn't been for Micah and Nathan, and we said, how do we work this in? We're just trying to get everywhere because I want to expose them to David. I want to let David's truth get out there because this stuff's unbelievable, right? You're like, wow, I wish I'd known this. Like I said, all the people who want to whine and complain about America, and yet no, they won't leave. What an awesome place. Not perfect, because there are human beings here. Therefore, if there are humans, you'll always know there's sin present. That's just the way it is. We live in a fallen world, and until Jesus comes again, we won't reach perfection, not here on earth. So what we're supposed to do is walk in his way and follow his path and follow his commandments. And engagement sure ought to be one of them, being salt and light. We want to get you involved. What we're doing is we have one pastor who he's semi-retired, he's bivocational. He took this. He just took it and ran with it. He went into the election commission in Virginia, and he had read the law. And he goes and sees the person running the election commission, and the guy said, we don't do it that way, we don't do it that way. And Pastor Tom said, how long have you been doing this? The guy said, 35 years. Tom said, you've been breaking Virginia state law for 35 years? And the guy said, you read the law? Tom says, right here on my tablet. And he said, you want to be on the election commission? Tom got on the board. The people that quit, those are firsthand stories from us. I love going to these other conferences. Everybody's telling our stories because that was my Faith Wins team in Virginia on the ground. That was those people. You know what? It wasn't a team. It was Calvary Baptist and Life Church and such a Methodist. It was all these churches of people who just said, I am sick and tired of my kids being exposed to this nonsense. This is disgusting. This is filth, and we cannot have it. It defies common sense. Yet we're being told we're the bad guy for saying it's a bad thing. We did not plan on doing poll workers. All we're doing is connecting you to the county people who do this work. That's all we're doing. Pastor Tom, when you hit this QR code, and nobody understands QR codes if you're over 14. So, but if you hold your camera up to that, like you're going to take a picture, it'll take you to our website. I don't have time to bug you or bother you. We will get your email, and Pastor Tom or somebody on his team will make sure you get put in the precinct in the county so you can go be a poll watcher or poll worker in whatever state. I think our pastors have now recruited poll watchers in 44 states. We had Maine. We haven't done a thing in Maine. So people are sharing this, and I know there are a lot of groups that want to do this. And look, my time machine doesn't work. I can't fix anything in the back, whether I like it or not. My time machine's broken. What I need to do is go do this. And we spend far too much time talking about this we can't fix. Let's go fix this. And I believe Christian involvement is the big deal. And I got to tell you, one of the least things we should do as Christians is get involved and go work the polls. It would stun you, the kind of things that you would see just by being there and being involved, and you'd feel like a great patriotic American. So please hit the QR code. Again, I just want to tell you, I'm so proud of your pastor leadership. I mean, Nathan running the whole thing with Life Church, and Micah here. That's what's missing. Ronald Reagan said in 1980, when the country was going to heck in a handbasket, there's nothing going on that cannot be fixed with proper leadership. That's what we want to do. I appreciate your leadership. God bless y'all. Thanks for having us.
Love you, brother. Man. Thank you.
Isn't that amazing? That's incredible. I hope you guys were so blessed. I know I was. And if you're like me, I'm sitting back. I feel like I know American history pretty well. I know Nathan, you feel like you know American history pretty well. But then you would see something like that, and you're like, I don't know American history very well. And I'm like, okay, I got to remember all these things. I'm trying to take notes on my phone real fast, right? But what we're going to do is this, we had Chad and David on the Jesus, Sex, and Politics podcast about a half hour prior to the start of this. So we're going to have that, and then we're going to put this on the podcast as well. This is going to be on our website. So you can go back and you can dissect everything that you heard David say. So... And then you can get involved with Faith Wins. I've really gotten to know Chad over the last year, and he is honestly has such a heart after the Lord's. He is so focused on turning America back towards biblical values, and they're doing great things, like he said. So make sure you sign up. Stop by the book table for David Barton, and we got his lovely wife Cheryl's with him today, so you guys can say hi to Cheryl. And I think we're out of the Founders Bibles. I think we sold out of them, unfortunately, but you can sign up to buy some more, and they can send you one. I think you can get them online and all the good stuff. But the American Story, Nathan and I have started reading that together. That is phenomenal. And that's David and his son Tim Barton, who Tim is a genius when it comes to American history too. They wrote that together. So pick that up. You're not going to want to miss that. And then the last thing, we've got Martin Struther back there from IFI, Indiana Family Institute. They're doing the local grassroots, getting school board candidates that are good, constitutionally focused and biblically aligned candidates elected. Talk to Martin about what you guys can do to help him here locally. And I think that's, the last thing Melissa just said, break down your boxes when you throw them away and on your way out. So that will help us. We love you guys, and we'd love to see you on church here Sunday. If you don't call this your home, the church, come check it out. But hey, have a great rest of your day. Be blessed and stand for truth in our country.